This is Herbie Girardet, distinguished environmentalist, filmmaker, writer, who has inspired many of us over the years. And now we're delighted to have him here, telling us about his latest thinking, which is also related to young people as well in the future. But first he's going to tell us a little bit about some of the scientific ideas he has and try and unpack it a little bit for us, what he's been thinking.
Well, this conference here is meant to deal with one of the great problems of our time, which is climate change. But it is very clear that the politicians, first of all, are not willing to do anything very significant. But even if they did, the agenda on which they're working is already wildly behind the science. Until recently, the assumption was that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere... It's fine.
Are you sure?
Until recently, the assumption was that carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere could double from what they were at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Then that has been revised downwards to 550 to 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now scientists are saying, no, we need to go down from actual concentrations of those greenhouse gases that are already up there in the atmosphere to a much lower figure. Now, the discussions here at this conference are not even beginning to address that issue, and yet that is what the science is telling us.
So really, when they're talking about reversing what's already there or what's already going to be in atmosphere from what we've already done. So it's not about not speeding up so much or not going on and on at the rate we are and lowering the rate of increase. You're talking about actually reversing. Isn't that the kind of thing that the small island states were also talking about last week? They wanted to go below 350 and we're already at 387. Is that right? But there are people saying that's completely impossible. Even to get to 450 is unlikely now.
Yeah, it is a very tall order indeed, particularly because every year at this moment in time, we burn the equivalent of 2 million years worth of fossil fuels. It took 300 million years for oil and coal and gas to accumulate in the Earth's crust, and we have been burning it until recently at about the rate of 1 million years per year. Now it's gone up with China and India catching up with Europe and America to something like 2 million years per year. So that is the challenge, the enormous challenge that, first of all, those countries that are now copying, the industrialized countries' lifestyles, need to very, very quickly indeed begin to switch towards renewable energy.
So we've really set a bad example in the north, those of us who live in the north, and we don't want people to copy that. But equally, there's the argument that, why should they suffer?
Well, they don't have to suffer. The fact is that we have amazing new technologies available to us now. And when you look at examples of countries like Germany or Spain or Portugal that are rapidly moving, or indeed Denmark, where this conference is being held, that are moving very rapidly towards powering their economies with renewable energy. That's the example that is now being copied also in places like China. India has very large-scale wind power development. There's going to be solar farms in Rajasthan and so on. But even if we did all of that and begin to rapidly switch towards renewables, we still wouldn't absorb the carbon already up there. And that can only be done by reviving our living mantle of the planet, the biosphere itself, and to increase its capacity to absorb carbon dioxide.
Goodness, so is it a bit like saying to a person, there are no more antibiotics you can take, you have to let your own immune system start to cope with this disease. You're encouraging us to behave towards the planet in ways that the planet itself, which is much bigger than any of us, can actually take on this task. Is that what something?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we have imposed a mechanical civilization on an organic planet, and that is the huge problem that we are now facing. Our mechanical systems are linear systems. We take resources from nature and then turn them into products and then dump them as indigestible waste in nature. We need to learn from nature's own circular system. We need to reintroduce the carbon cycle. We need to strengthen the water cycle. We need to strengthen all the circular systems of the planet in order to enable it to cope with us and our enormous impacts. And that is the challenge today.
Herbie, that sounds very inspiring, but what does it mean in practice, go from this kind of linear system that we're operating into a circular system? Can you give an example that clarifies it?
Well, I've been particularly interested in looking at cities and their resource consumption patterns. Take, for instance, London. London per week uses the equivalent of 2 super tankers of oil. So it's an enormous quantity of oil that is required in order to keep that system going. Now, if London were to run on, first of all, renewable energy, and that's beginning to be considered very seriously, firstly. Secondly, if it insulated its buildings much better, like they have done here in Copenhagen, which they have set wonderful examples. But thirdly, if it's also its waste management system was to become a circular system where all wastes become input into new growth, particularly organic waste for organic farming on the edge of cities, the industrial waste for new industrial production, keeping that separate from nature. These are all things that are now being done on a small scale somewhere on the planet. And the trick is to scale it up and make it become mainstream.
I remember, Herbie, years and years ago, you told us about how in Sweden, for instance, some of the waste heat from factories was then rechanneled under the roads. So instead of one being a pollutant going up into the sky and another, the roads requiring more energy to remove the ice, one helped the other. And so this is, or think about permaculture, for instance. So it's like these kinds of small-scale ideas being put into a macro scale.
Well, in recent years, there have become much larger scale ideas implemented, particularly in Scandinavia. I mean, Copenhagen, for instance, as a city, is probably one of the most sustainable large cities in the world because, first of all, it has combined heat and power systems you describe, where it's not only the energy used in power stations that then is used inefficiently, but all the waste heat goes to around houses. And if you stay in a house in Copenhagen, as I'm doing at the moment, in a flat, that is heated with waste heat from a power station. In London, in the UK, it goes into the atmosphere, number one. Number two, they have done amazing recycling projects in this city, particularly also for organic waste. So certainly, cities all over the world are competing with each other to improve their environmental performance, and that certainly has major implications for the future of the planet as a whole.